McIntaffer. I am the marketing manager here with Casey Peterson. We're a CPA and financial advising firm based in Rapid City, South Dakota. We're pleased to bring you today a quick overview of the application process for the state of South Dakota Coronavirus Relief Fund for small businesses and nonprofits. It opened on October 13th and applications are due October 23rd. Our income partner and nonprofit government team member, DeShayne Hoag, will lead you through key points to consider as you fill out an application for grant funds. DeShayne's extensive audit and internal controls experience includes several years working with clients in sectors including government, nonprofits, HUD, and rural development programs. DeShayne, thank you so much for taking the time today. Nonprofits and small businesses in the state understand this new funding resource available to them to navigate the COVID pandemic.
Thank you, Jessica. So I'm going to go over, like Jessica mentioned, some of the brief items included in the application process. We'll go over the eligibility criteria as well, and then also touch on the calculations that you'll need to be considering and then performing in the application itself. So there are two separate applications that are available. The first one is for small businesses, nonprofits, and small startups. And then the other one is for community-based healthcare providers and acute care hospitals. And so this chart shows the different funding sources available under each and the grant amounts that would be provided under those different programs, how the award methodology is going to be performed, and then the eligibility criteria as well. And so for organizations that would potentially qualify under multiple or under both applications, we would urge you to look through this and really weigh which program application would be the most fitting and the most beneficial for your organization. The award process, eligible applicants will complete the application online on the state's website at covid.sd.gov. And those applications are required to be completed by October 23rd. After the applications are submitted, they will be reviewed. And then that's when the final award amounts will be calculated. And that's going to be performed on a proportional share of the available funds. Applicants will be notified of the status and the dollar amount that they will be awarded. The maximum award amount for the small business and nonprofit and startups is $100,000, and then awards will not be given for amounts calculated beneath $750. The eligibility criteria is the same for nonprofits and small businesses. We urge you to go out to the state's website and look at that criteria, but some general information, they are for entities that must be physically located in South Dakota, must meet the financial criteria, and then must also be considered a going concern, which that just means that the business is financially strong enough to continue operating for the foreseeable future. And then also they must have gross revenues of less than $38.5 million. So next I'm going to share my screen and we can look at the application itself.
So again, the application is on covid.sd.gov and they need to register, correct, to get to the application?
Correct. Yep. You'll have to create an account and you need to create, so there will be separate applications. Say, for example, you would have multiple entities that you would be submitting applications for. You would have a separate account, an application for each one of those entities. Okay. And you can create multiple applications and the users are based on your email address. So you would just create another application under a different email address and submit it that way. So the first section is business information. At the top of the page, you will select which program you're applying to, whether it's a small business, nonprofit, or small startup. And then you include the business information. So here's where you would include the EIN or the TIN, the business name, type of corporation, type of business, and then some other general information. The red asterisks indicate required fields. And then there are some other fields included in here as well. So just some typical information where the entity is located, physical address, mailing information, banking information, they're including that in the application. Likely to simplify the process once those awards are determined so that they can be dispersed and dropped into the entity's accounts. And the next section is ownership information. So here you would include the name, last name, percentage of ownership, answer these fields here, and then that's when you would create the owner. If there were multiple, they would be listed down here. Once you have all of that filled out, then you would click save and proceed on to the next step. Part 3 is for the funding and eligibility information. This is a question as to whether or not you have any delinquent 2019 or previous property taxes, sales taxes, liens, things like that. And then whether you are current on South Dakota State Department of Revenue Services reporting and fees. Part 4 is for additional assistance information. This is where you're going to be attesting to whether or not you've received any federal funds related to COVID-19, and then also indicating that you've had a reduction in business of over 25%. So the first 2 fields, those are yes and no answers. And then next, you're going to include the reason for the reduction in business. If you hover your mouse over these, you can read the whole description. And then you just use these arrows to select the ones that are most fitting and appropriate for your entity's circumstances. At the bottom here, that's where you're going to list the COVID-19 funding received. So you're not actually required to upload or provide any support for the funding received. You just, it's informational, so you're going to drop in those amounts here in those fields. And then we get to the required documentation. So you're actually going to upload those in this files Dropbox here, and then you would go through and check the boxes of whether or not you've included those pieces of information. The state is accepting just a screenshot of the certificate of good standing from the Secretary of State. You don't actually need to upload the formal document. The screenshot is sufficient. And then there are other pieces for including the previous tax returns. There's differences between businesses that have received over $150,000 in gross revenue and ones that have received less, and I'll touch on that in a bit. And then also the W-9. And then the last step is for certifications and authorizations. This is where you're going to certify that you've included accurate information and that your business has been interrupted or impacted by COVID-19. And once you've gone through all of those steps, then you include your name and your date, and then that's when you would submit the application. So some other information in performing those calculations, for the small business and nonprofits, this area is the same. You're going to be submitting the financial statements on the cash basis, and the time period for looking at those amounts is going to be from March through August of 2019 compared to March through August of 2020. So it's important to use the same periods in that calculation. And you're going to use cash basis for the method. So that's true cash receipts and cash disbursements. You're not going to include non-cash things such as depreciation expense, amortization expense. You're not factoring in things like accounts payable and accounts receivable. It's truly just the cash inflows and outflows during those 2 time frames.
So that would mean, would you take out pledges, DeShayne, for nonprofits?
Yep. So for nonprofits that have pledges receivable, you're not going to be including those within these revenue figures. You're actually going to be including, say, for example, contributions that you would have received either through the pledge agreement process or just contributions or donations that you would have received on the cash basis. throughout that time frame. So if, for example, someone had pledged to donate to your organization during this time frame, but didn't actually make any pledge payments, then you would not include that in the calculation. But say, for example, they did make a pledge and then they paid a portion of that pledge during this time frame, you'd include the portion of the pledge that they paid. Does that make sense?
Yep, that's really helpful. So it's basically you would, from your accounting software, pull a profit and loss from the two time periods and then subtract them from each other and then subtract any federal funding to make sure that you qualified with you had a 25% reduction.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, that seems very simple. If they need support getting those documents, they should talk to their accountants, bookkeepers, financial providers.
Yes, yep. If you're needing help, either figuring out how to run those reports out of your accounting systems, just reach out to your accountant. They'd be happy to walk you through that process and kind of help you, and maybe even help you with determining the cash basis figures as well.
Okay.
Something else to note is that there are differences between businesses and nonprofits with greater than 150,000 in 2019 revenue and then less than 150,000 in 2019 revenue. So for the documentation required, if you have greater than 150,000 in 2019 revenue, then you're going to provide the 2019 tax return and a detailed profit and loss statement, as we said, on the cash basis for both of those two periods, the 2019 and the 2020 period. But if you have less than the 150,000 in 2019 revenue, then you're going to be providing the 2019 tax returns and then the 2020 income and expenses on the cash basis for the period of March through August of 2020.
So yeah, definitely there's some minor differences on each of these depending on your circumstances. So to review all the documentation on covid.sd.gov before you prepare your application.
Yes, definitely. And then nonprofits are also required to submit the first page of the 990 filing from 2019.
Okay. And then it did say you needed a W-9. So is that just Google a new W-9 form to complete, save, and attach? Is that the easiest way, DeShayne?
I think that's probably the easiest way. I think that they're asking for that information primarily so that they have the information, the EIN, business information, the type of entity, things like that.
Okay. And then I know the small businesses and nonprofits application, they need to be cash basis. I'm sure we have some nonprofits that might be eligible for a community-based healthcare grant. So is there something that might be beneficial for them to look at that one versus just the nonprofit grant?
Definitely. So the community-based healthcare providers, those are going to be entities like nursing homes, skilled nursing facilities, the senior nutrition. Some of those entities might also be nonprofits, and so they could apply for applications under both methods. And there are differences between the applications. So for the community-based healthcare providers, as we mentioned earlier, there's really no limit on the amount received, whereas for nonprofits, the limit is $100,000. And so you really want to consider which one might be the most beneficial for your organization and maybe the amount of funds that are available under that program. There are differences there, but then also the calculation of that process as well.
Okay, back to that chart. So again, you were talking about with a nonprofit that might be providing support through federal or state funding, maybe a senior nutrition provider or a behavioral health provider might be a better fit to apply under community-based healthcare. And there's differences in that application and eligibility requirements versus the nonprofit. Okay.
Yep, exactly. So the funding allocation, you can see there, it's a little bit higher. And then, as I mentioned, the award amounts. And as far as the calculation process, it's going to be looking at the same time frame. So as we mentioned, the March through August 2019 compared to March through August of 2020. But unlike the small business and nonprofit side, the healthcare application does not specify which accounting basis is to be used. So you're allowed to either use the cash basis or the accrual basis. And definitely make sure that you're using the same basis for both periods. So if you're determining cash basis is the most fitting and appropriate for my organization, then you want to use cash basis figures and then also provide the cash basis reports in your required documentation that you upload for 2019 and then cash basis for 2020 as well.
Okay.
And it might be worthwhile, depending on the nature of the business, to run some calculations under both the cash basis and the accrual basis to see which one might be the best fit. Say, for example, the entity had difficulty with cash flow throughout the year, but obligations are building up, then the accrual method might be more beneficial because you have those bills that are due, but you didn't have enough cash flow to pay those. If you're using the cash receipt, the cash method, then you're not getting credit for those bills that you actually owe.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay.
And then similarly with the receivables, if you're accruing receivables from things like charges for services, but those recipients aren't able to pay their bills, and so the cash isn't coming in, then it may be more beneficial to use the cash basis method. Because if you're using accrual basis, then you're counting those in your revenues. Whereas the cash basis method, you're not counting those because you didn't actually receive any money from those bills that you sent to those recipients.
Do we want to touch on the startups just a little bit, because they are slightly different since they're a new entity, basically?
Yep, definitely. And something else that I should mention with the community-based healthcare provider calculation, that it takes gross revenue into consideration. So that means you're going to be including the revenue figures in whole. You're not going to be taking the revenue amount and excluding any expenses such as cost of sales. For example, if your entity operates a senior nutrition program, then your gross revenue would be the charges for meals, and you would not exclude the cost of those meals.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. So then related to the startups, the state has provided a specific template that you would complete for those applications. And grant funding is available for businesses that were established between September 1st of 2019 through June 1st of 2020. And that calculator is available on the state's COVID-19 website. And that is something that you're going to have to upload with the documentation. And then the eligibility can be calculated on two methods. The first one is a reduction in average monthly income. And then the next one is net operating loss. So if the startup were to pass one of those two methods for eligibility, then that's when the award is going to be calculated based on cash expenses from March to August 2020. Again, this excludes non-cash things like the depreciation expense, amortization, and other non-cash expenses. But you are able to include the capital expenditures in the 2020 cash expense calculation.
The application seems pretty simple. It sounds more like there's definitely some financials to gather and documentation to prepare before you apply. And because we have a little over a week, right, a week and a half, they're due on the 23rd, that allows people time to prepare the pieces and make sure they have an accurate application before submitting.
Yeah.
So yeah, I want to thank you so much, DeShayne, for walking through this. And probably just a reminder too that we're always here for you. If you need any support on preparing those financials or any questions, please reach out to us, and our associates and professionals would be more than happy to assist you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.